Good morning, everyone. We will just take a couple of minutes for all our attendees to settle themselves. We are looking at a 11:05 starting time. But thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. We will be beginning in the next 2 minutes. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Sandy, can you hear me?
Morning, Anzio. Yes, we can.
Thank you. I just wanted to check.
Amazing. Thank you. Good morning, colleagues, friends, and partners. A warm welcome to today's Grassroots Wednesday webinar hosted by the Hlanganisa Community Fund. My name is Sandy Lendelu. I am the Advocacy Manager here at Hlanganisa, and I'll be co-facilitating the session alongside my colleague, Misadi Machia Malinga, who is the Program Officer for Partner Support and Resilience. Today's webinar is titled The National Dialogue, Promise, Pitfall, or Political Performance. Before we begin in earnest, a note on some housekeeping. This webinar will run until 1 p.m. today. We request that everyone stay on mute unless you have been called on to speak. We also request that all participants use the chat box actively. You're welcome to share your reflections, post questions, and engage one another in the chat box. We will also have a dedicated question and answer session later on, but please feel free to note your questions as the discussion progresses over the next 2 hours. So South Africa is currently in a moment of political experimentation. The national dialogue process has been launched with the stated intention of fostering consensus, building national cohesion, and addressing the deep fractures that continue to undermine our nascent democracy. But as many of you know, the questions remain sharp. Is the national dialogue a truly citizen-led initiative, or is it another mechanism to contain dissent and consolidate power? Does the national dialogue open up space for grassroots voices, or does it risk reproducing the very inequities it claims to address? For some, the national dialogue is an opportunity to shape the trajectory of our democracy. But for others, it's a stage-managed performance with little real promise for those who are most marginalized amongst us. And so today at this Grassroots Wednesday webinar, we are hoping to convene a space where we can engage one another and dialogue one another in honesty, in critique, and with imagination. We're going to use the space to ultimately ask a big question. And that question is, should civil society, particularly community-based organizations, invest in the national dialogue, or should we be, as community-based organizations, building and strengthening alternative spaces for real transformation? And by the end of today's conversation, we hope to walk away with a clearer sense of the opportunities and risks of civil society participation in the national dialogue. We also hope to collate a record of grassroots reflections to inform our collective strategies as the national dialogue process continues to unfold. We also seek to create stronger connections between community-based organizations, activists, and thinkers in terms of with the goal of interrogating the future of democratic participation in South Africa. And to assist us with this conversation today, we are honored to be joined by 3 distinguished speakers whose organizing, thinking, and leadership deeply shape our civic and political landscape. As part of our speakers today, we will have Anzio Jacobs, who is a strategist, an advocate, and also plays the role of being the coordinator of the Civil Society National Dialogue Caucus. Anzio works at the intersection of philanthropy, civil society, and children's rights. And they anchor, and they do this while anchoring collaborative platforms such as the Social Justice Assembly. Their approach is grounded in feminist and decolonial principles with a focus on redistribution, participation, and systemic change. Welcome, Anzio, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. Joining Anzio, we also have Noncedo Madube-Dube. And Noncedo is a queer Black feminist, and she's also the outgoing General Secretary of Equal Education. Noncedo brings over 15 years of experience in organizing, popular education, and movement building. She currently serves on the boards of the Health Justice Initiative, as well as the Reading Panel 2030. And she also remains deeply invested in cultivating radical imaginations for sustaining people's movements. And so welcome to you, Nonleto. We are also joined by Thapelo Mohapi, who is the General Secretary of Abahlali Basemjondolo. Abahlali Basemjondolo is South Africa's largest shack dwellers movement. Thapelo has led Abahlali Basemjondolo through exponential growth and has represented the movement nationally and internationally, despite facing repression and attacks. His leadership is grounded in the belief that grassroots organizing is key to changing the political frame um, within South Africa. And so thank you to our speakers. And we hope to have a fruitful and meaningful discussion and engagement with all of them. If our speakers could kindly perhaps put on their cameras so they can be spotlighted as we begin our conversation. I believe all of us are spotlighted. Thank you so much. And so perhaps I want to start off this part of our session today, which is the panel discussion, with a set of provocative questions, which will be directed to each of our speakers in turn. And perhaps I would like to start with you, Anzio, as somebody who has been engaged in the national dialogue process, probably from the very start or very close there too. What is the national dialogue, both in form and substance, and what political work does the national dialogue process intend on doing during this current political moment in South Africa?
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm so glad to be here with Nonleto and Thapelo, and really interested in what we can generate coming out of this discussion. To answer your question, the national dialogue is not a single event. And I think that this is a common misconception. I think a lot of South Africans thought that the National Dialogue Convention that took place in August was the be-all and end-all of this discussion, when in reality it was meant to be the kick-off of a process. And this process, one would be flawed in thinking that it started in August. The process has been a long time coming. In fact, for about 4 or 5 years, to the best of my recollection, ahead of the National Dialogue Convention, there have been many conversations that have pointed to the need for a national dialogue. Now, I think at the heart of the national dialogue, a lot of people believe that the intention is to come together and have a conversation where we figure out what South African problems are. And I think that's a fundamentally flawed understanding. We know what the problems are in South Africa. There's no need to rehash them. We know there's unemployment. We know there's land dispossession. We know that there are serious issues with our healthcare systems. We know about immigration and the like. I think what the National Dialogue attempts to do is it's attempting to move us a step ahead, is to say, now that we know what the problems are, what are the solutions that we can generate? We've tried our level best to use the mechanism of the Constitution and an elected set of officials to advance the ambitions of South Africa from the point of the Freedom Charter and beyond. And we've found this to be a lacking modality, in that our leadership, our elected leadership over the last 30 years has in many instances made progress, but in several instances have not achieved the mandate that was put before them. And so I think the national dialogue is calling then on multiple sectors to get involved, whereas we've historically leaned on government as the main kind of actor in this space. We've traditionally gone to business and labor. But I think why the national dialogue in its form and architecture becomes interesting is that it deliberately and I think at the moment most comprehensively involves a broad range of civil society. In fact, my recollection tells me that the involvement of civil society at this point, we last saw such a broad church in the context of the UDF. Civil society from all corners have been called to come into this process. So I think that's what marks it as different. I think also the process is meant to be one that is people-led or citizen-led. And I think that this is another salient feature of this that distinguishes it and sets it apart from other such convenings or discussions. We have always been called into these commissions and similar modalities of engaging as South Africans, where we are led by government, or we're led by business, or we're led by labor. And we forget that ordinary South Africans have a great breadth of knowledge themselves. Indeed, it's the lived experiences of ordinary South Africans that should enable us to have a robust discussion. I think the substance of the national dialogue is one that asks us to look at the Constitution meaningfully. The Constitution starts with a preamble that says, "We the people shall lead." And this is the response, I think, in many ways to that statement that says, if indeed ordinary South Africans are leading, then we should not only look to government for the solutions. And again, that has been our starting point. We have gone to government and said, we've elected you, do the things that we're asking you to do. But because that is not working, and because the Constitution leaves room for a reimagination of the Constitution within the context of our democracy, I think the national dialogue presents that opportunity. It also surfaces some shared truths, The national dialogue, in many ways, we saw this in the convention. We are not going to have a simple conversation here. Those that are dispossessed of land are not going to keep quiet at the table. Women who are fundamentally and frequently victimized through gender-based violence and femicide have already tried to engage in a process of their own that has yielded little fruit. We know that organized business and labor often leads the way that our country functions, and even the way our leadership is responsive to it. But what does that say about the ordinary citizen again? And so this process in its design calls on the ordinary citizen via sectors to come and lead the process. I think that's one thing that's important about it. The second one is it collates the information of several gatherings that precede it. And it says, look, if you want to know what the problem is, here is what has been said before. So don't come and rehash the problem here. I think in the third instance, it then says, this cannot be a 1 day or a 3 day or a 3 month process. We are going to set out a time frame of 12 to 18 months where we will start to ask ordinary South Africans to feed into the feedback of the national dialogue and point out for themselves what are some of the solves that we can prioritize in our communities. So, for an example, if a community has a challenge with a lack of water, the way that the dialogue map works is that it says, point out that there is a problem with the lack of water, and let us then deploy a rapid response mechanism in the form of the interministerial committee. Now, when you look at that interministerial committee, again, we've done interministerial committees before. What makes this different? The thing that makes this different is that civil society, and indeed the Civil Society National Dialogue Caucus and many other groups, have come and they said, whoa, you can't just say you're going to do this thing. Transparently tell us how and when it is going to be done so that we can track you in the public realm, and we will keep you accountable in this process. Now, why again does this look different from what has been done before? Civil society in the past has called on government to be transparent, but hasn't been at the table to ensure that transparency. And so I think that's what sets this process apart. Just as I finalize this point, I think it is also equally important to note that if you look at the context of the convention, initially 22 sectors are identified as key sectors which need to be covered in this conversation. And in the context of the convention, those that were in the room say, no. If you want to run a process like this, you can't do it without these additional sectors. And so what happens immediately in response to that is the convention organizing committee then says, no, we recognize that there is a legitimate reason why there should be more sectors, and we do want this to be a broad church and get as many diverse views as possible. Let's then extend the sectoral allocations to ensure that those who do not feel represented are also then able to come to the table. And that then initiates a process where citizens are identified in the steering committee from all walks of life. The steering committee, which is now being, it's in its final phases of being finalized, then is meant to indicate representation from all of the 9 provinces. In the first instance, every province must be represented. It asks for a clarity on a gender makeup to reflect the gender makeup of the country. It also asks for racial diversity per the way the country is made up, so that everybody's voice can be included there. And maybe as a parting shot then to say, especially the dissenting voices, because we cannot come to the table and only have those that agree with us. It would be fundamental to have those that disagree. And so I really liked the preamble to this conversation that says, should civil society be involved? We should be asking critical questions in this context. We've got major and pressing issues that are divisive. We've got the issue of land and the redistribution of land. We've got the issue of joblessness. We've got the issue of the healthcare system and immigration. And those are divisive issues. So we do have to have a diverse range of voices, but also make room for dissenting voices so that those that often are not in agreement with one another are not sidelined in the conversation, and we prioritize also views that are not congruent with our own. So maybe I can leave it there. I hope it paints some sort of picture of what this hopes to achieve.
Thank you so much, Anzio. I think, you know, your intervention has been really rich, because I think it's really sort of framed the overview of the national dialogue process, but it's also really driven home that one of the aspirations of the national dialogue process is that it is a solutions based space, right? Like, this is a process to collectively come to some answers around solutions. But it's also, as you said, purports to be a citizen-led or a people-led process. And I think you gave some examples in terms of what that sort of leadership from citizens and ordinary people has looked like thus far. And you've also started painting a picture of what that leadership at the grassroots level could potentially look like as the national dialogue process unfolds. Nonqedo, I want to bring you into the conversation at this moment, because as somebody who, you know, led a movement such as equal education, you are no stranger to engaging and interfacing with various stakeholders, including the state, business, etc. And my question to you is, what does meaningful participation of particularly social movements and community-based organizations, as well as the communities that they serve, look like in terms of the national dialogue process? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Marlene. It's good to be here. Good morning to everyone. I'm going to try to organize my thoughts into 3 to answer that question. First, I just want to say that the organization that I struggle with, that is my political home, had sent a delegation to the National Convention. So we'd met a few weeks ago now at a kickoff of the dialogue process. But before heading there, we talked to other social movements that we think we are aligned in spirit and in politics. And the reason that's important, we didn't speak to civil society because we all think and act and want different things. We first talked to those that we thought the politics is aligned and the way we do the politicking is aligned, because we don't want to explain things to each other at this point. And what we agreed to do, I mean, there were conversations there around, is there some kind of protest of disruption? Some were saying, no, but we're already inside now. We are on the program. Some people are getting flights booked. Our delegation, by the way, in the majority, came from Gauteng, because we weren't going to spend money to get our people to this gathering. And what we agreed to do is put our words together on a public platform. And what we were saying is that we are in the room, but we are not endorsing the convention or the dialogue. But the reason we thought it was important to be in the room, because I think this approach around outside and inside is useful, comrades, because you don't want to be outside of a process and still try influence its direction. But you also don't want to be inside of a process where we've been organizing for education and youth justice issues in South Africa for 17 years now. And the gains we've been able to build are phenomenal, but the regression is just as phenomenal. And it's by the same government. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. 70% of its unemployed are young people. Children are dying in toilets at schools. Less than 40% of young people in this country participate in the formal electoral process out of choice, not apathy. We are the most unequal country in the world. I don't even know if people, when we say that thing, they understand what we mean. There's a growing population. 68% of children, by the time that they're 11, they would have been going at least 1 day a week without food. That's our country. And so we participate, but we don't endorse. Okay. So I'm just trying to answer your question, Sandy, around what does it mean to legitimately participate in something? Ne? And is this process what we thought could be legitimate at the time? Okay. Now, then we're at the dialogue. Okay, so this is point number 2. And there's obviously a skepticism because I've just painted a picture of where we live. Ne? There's a skepticism because our experience is not dignified as young people and young Blacks in South Africa. But there's also huge hope because we've gathered. And the framing, what Angie was talking about, is part of the narrative that that group that Angie was working with, of civil society, is carrying into the process, right? And it's a narrative and a politics that we are aligned to. So we've got big hope. Surely something will come of this because we now are here, yeah? And there is an opportunity XYZ. But the experience actually is quite contrary to the hope, which is sad because, at least for me, I've convinced Thapelo young people in my own movement to come into the room, to leave their work of struggling with their peers to go to a building that they probably can't even access, EUNISA, because higher education is another big story here. Yeah, to go to a building with men in suits to go potentially build our version of democracy. Okay, and you arrive there, first you are bombarded by 50,000 blue lights, 6,000 men in suits. I've never seen anything like it. In fact, as someone that is contrary to the law, most times I was nervous. I didn't do anything on that day, but I was stressed. Many blue lights and law enforcement such. And then there was a kind of impunity even inside. The design of the space was such that we minimize plenary, we go spend time in the dialogue labs. But even in between the plenary to the dialogue labs, the participation of our governments was just as if we were at a Lekotla at the beginning of this year. There was nothing different. There wasn't a culture shift in those that we are coming to engage. Because remember, Andrea says, and that's right, we are clear on the issues. In fact, we're even clear on the solutions. Now we need space. There must be political will is the crisis in South Africa, to do things differently and not progressionally, not a long process of reform now, very urgently. But there wasn't that kind of appetite, which shows me that despite civil society saying, we will help you get to a kickoff and we will use our spirits and bodies and sweat to build some legitimacy around this process and protect it, there is no appetite from all of government. And I'm not now going to fantasize around certain political parties and the non-existent alternatives, all of it. All of the political elite are not interested in a change in the status quo. And so now we're left wanting. And so what it felt like, and my concern around what it's going to continue to feel like, is participation and not leading it. So that's the second bit. The third is that I want us to be careful of a few things. Because as much as we're calling for some revolutionary moment or reckoning from government, we must also call it for ourselves. Ne? I can't also say I will stay outside and zabalaza here and we'll organize big marches if I'm not willing to come to the table differently as well. That I take that point fairly, but we must be careful what we're promising people. The first thing is that this is not equivalent to the UDF moment because there is no political work around the potential of what we're doing here. There are enough meetings to update each other, but it has no politics. And the white lady trying to run dialogue labs at the National Dialogue or conventional kickoff is far from the intention of that kind of work. And so even the worry for me is when we say we're going to go deploy each other at ward level, not with the kind of mayhem and violent political hegemony that the country has at the moment. We have to prepare ourselves together, build power, knowing, strength together. That's not happening at the moment. And it's caught up inside deeply technocratic processes because, again, the political elite are holding the process hostage. They aren't interested in anything different happening. The second thing, so the agenda setting, I can empathize with the need for the agenda setting to happen in ways that are technocratic in some ways so that it takes all the different sectors along and there is a process. But if that stuff is not happening in a political process, deeply grassrooted, then it's not real. And Sandy, this could be one attempt of something like that, the political work around what this thing could mean, right? These Grassroots Wednesdays. But as people were coming on, actually, I was thinking, damn, in my own movement, I don't think we could organize a meeting like this and so many people show up. But that's because we wouldn't have the opportunity to give people data. And then I went, oh no, look, these are comrades of Hlanganisa. So also the quasi-donor partner. I can imagine you're progressive, I love you comrades inside Hlanganisa. So it's not an indictment. But because you have that kind of convening power that is associated with resources and money, you can convene people like this. But how else are we doing these things? Are we going to arrive and kick off in 2 months and go off to the wards now? You know what I mean? Where is this continuing to happen so that it's truly the politics of the equivalent to a modern day UDF? And the last, and this is also to comrades that are on the call here and thinking about your own participation. I think it is untrue that this process is offering a different opportunity for transparency and coordination across sectors. And the reason I say that is because social movements, which are the people you've gathered here, Sandy, would be very different from NGOs. Yeah, if you had gathered another group of people, maybe we can make the claim that this process is different because after you've engaged government, gotten some kind of buy-in on the thing you want, then you must sit and wait for policy. That's not how movements work. The transparency mechanism is built into our way of work. It's inside the politics of how we do this work. And it's not advocacy 101, it's movement building 101. After we've made the claim, there's no water in the school, there's a regional issue around the policy, around who's in power to change the situation. We are there taking it to the end, till the time the schools have boreholes or water tanks, njalo njalo. And that's the difference between NGO intervention and a people's power through a grassroots social movement that's trying to make things happen in real time. And I'm just making that last point because I'm hoping that people that are on here do not feel despondency around what is still possible. This moment still belongs to us. And what we should be using it is to connect with each other and build the muscle of talking to one another, to build an intersectional struggle. That was my biggest love takeaway from the convention at UNISA, is that we actually don't know how to talk to each other, even us progressives. And so that's maybe the focus of how we do this. But Comrade Sandy and Anzio, we need to resource the struggle, unfortunately. Silambile. There's no ways I'm coming, can't romanticize the thing of coming to community halls. Silambile. Onwards, to find the people, the money, comrades.
Thank you so much, Nonweto. I think, again, really rich and thoughtful intervention on your part. Certainly, there's things for me that have been foregrounded by your intervention, such as the question of political alignment and what that means. And I think it's also connected to the question of how we gather ourselves? What are the resources? What's the infrastructure that we need to bring all of us together in one space, to be of the same mind? Another thing that stood out for me in your intervention was this question of a gap between the hope, the big hope, I think was the term you used, that we had for this process, and the gap in terms of the experience up until this current date, for the people who've been engaging in the national dialogue process. And I think there's something to be said about the work that's needed to then close that gap. How do we make sure that the gulf, the distance between our hope and what we're currently experiencing the process as is narrowed? And perhaps that's something that we can discuss in the next round of questions. You also touched on the crisis of political will, and that there's also a fear that, citizen-led, people-led is actually not really going to pan out in that way unless radical interventions are made to bring more people, social movements in particular, into the fold. And then lastly, I think another thing that stood out for me from you, Nonwedo, was the call to action that you made around that this work requires resources. And so certainly Hlanganisa, is hearing you and hearing you clearly. And if there are some of our colleagues within the philanthropic space in this core, I also hope that that is a call to action that you are also sitting with. How can we ensure that the movements, the community-based organizations, the activists at the grassroots levels have the necessary resources that they need to meaningfully participate, engage, and lead this national dialogue process? This also then leads me to you, Thapelo, and I know that abahlali basemjondolo, similarly to equal education, were part of those progressive social movements who had said that, listen, we are going to participate in this thing in a critical way, right? And they really, I think, made a persuasive case for critical participation, and holding on to the hope that because we are in the room, we're able to imbue the process with our politics as people who are social movements and community-based organizations. And so my question to you, though, is, I think one of the elephants in the room, when I'm always having these engagements around the national dialogue, particularly with community-based organizations, with social movements, with grassroots activists, is that there's a deep fear of the threats of co-optation, and that engaging in such close proximity with the state, with business, and with other sort of technocrats could dilute the radical demands of social movements, of grassroots organizations. And so I want to hear from you, Thapelo. How has abahlali basemjondolo navigated the threats of co-optation and dilution of their radical politics in terms of this process, the national dialogue process, but also in terms of the work that you continue to do, on a day-to-day basis? How do you sort of organize yourself to protect and insulate yourself against being swallowed up by these big institutions and these big processes, and that so that the bite in your politics remains alive?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to Hlanganisa. Thank you to Comrade Enzio and Comrade Nonwedo. the comrades that I've worked with for quite some time now in the struggle for justice, equality, and human dignity. First and foremost, I would like to say that the reasons why we were there was, of course, to ensure that the process is not hijacked by the political elite and, of course, businesses and the elite in general. But we were there because for many years, for more than 20 years, I mean, the movement has existed now. On Saturday, we're celebrating 20 years of our existence. 20 years of shame, 20 years of indignity, 20 years where we've seen people being burnt alive in the Czech settlements. We've had a 19-month baby being burnt in Kennedy Road. And the reason why that baby was denied a life before they come to this world and see this world is because they were born out of a poor family. Their crime is being born in a poor family. Their crime is being born out in a country where corruption has become rampant. Corruption has become the order of the day. Corruption has robbed many young people access to education. Corruption has ensured that healthcare in Tembisa, as we have seen recently, is not provided properly because there are those who are enriching themselves and those who are politically connected who have no disregard, who have no regard whatsoever for the poor and marginalized. Our humanity counted for nothing. And when we get an opportunity like this, we said we're going to be there, but to ensure that the processes are rooted on the ground, that the poor and marginalized like ourselves can have a word on the table and inform the decisions that have been made. And one of the things that had happened when we were taken into commission, because before the process, before the invitation in Abahlali and Jondolo, it was discussed in the National Council, it was discussed in the Chairpersons Forum, the chairpersons of branches, more than 104 branches that we have along the country. It was discussed in the Women's League, it was discussed in the Youth League. It was then taken into the General Assembly, and there were robust discussions as to how can we participate in this discussion? Why must we go and be part of this? Many discussions have taken place in this country. Many discussions have failed in this country, and many discussions have become talk shops, and we have not seen any tangible things that are happening on the ground. And we said then we were there to ensure that it does not become a process that is informed by the political elite, that is not a process that is informed by government itself. But it showed when we arrived at UNISA that we have a government that is detached from what is happening on the ground. We have a government, when government comes closer to the people, you must know that the government is in trouble. So this process tells us that government does not know how to approach the issues that we are facing. The government of the day does not know how many people suffer in the informal settlements. The government of the day does not know what it's like to carry your CV on an empty stomach, trying to find some work somewhere and being denied. It does not know the feeling of a parent who puts water on the stove and pretend that they are cooking to make sure that the children go to sleep, hoping that there will be food, when she knows that there would be nothing to eat for that day. But to keep the children in hope, she lit that stove and put water as if she's got something to cook. So that's the reality of South Africans that we are facing. That is a reality that we want to bring into the dialogue. And the notion that we are going to now be captured because we are there. I think one of the things that we have as a movement, we were given a mandate when we went into the dialogue. And when we were voted in by some organization to participate and lead in the various committees, we said, no, that is not the mandate we were given by our organization. And we must go back engage with our organization. And that is to show that we are not going to be captured. We knew why we were there. We knew that who the people we represent, but we knew what we were sent to do in this process, rather than to actually be excited and be nominated into committees. And now you already participating in committees, and without the mandates of the people. And one of the things that we must guide against in this process is that as the poor and marginalized, particularly living in informal settlement in the rural areas, those who go into schools, in the poor schools in the rural areas, when you are poor and struggling, there is a notion and a thinking from government and the other elites that you cannot think for yourself, you cannot do things for yourself, and they even hire consultants to think about people's development. So the developments that are taking place in our township are planned by people who are living in Sentin, in Umhlanga, in the most well-to-do areas, because we are assumed to be people who do not think. And we are going into the dialogues because we want to affirm our existence, our humanity, our dignity must count this time around, and we are not going to compromise that. And we're unapologetic about our dignity. When it comes to our dignity, we have no honorables, we have no worship and so forth, but we are going to fight for our existence, and we are going to ensure that the political elite who continue to enrich themselves and their families out of our desperation, that do not hijack the process, and that the process is rooted on the ground, and that's why we are there. So while we complain and struggle outside, but we must also ensure that we also struggle and change the policies and inform the policies that are going to favor the poor and marginalized people of South Africa. I think we've waited too long. 30 years is too long, and we've suffered too long. We inherited poverty from our parents. We will not have our children inherit poverty from us. We must make sure that those who are not accountable, that they can do as they please over our lives. That thank you very much for the opportunity, Hlanganisa. Thank you very much for the opportunity for everyone who is here. But I want to call on South Africans who are here today that the time is now. We will never, this is the time where we need not to surrender. This is not the time to give our power to those who have abused our power. We must dare and speak our voice. We must make sure that Ugogo Ohlala in the Eastern Cape, who has been suffering for too long, walking a long distance to a clinic, and a child who walks to get their education, that their voice is here in the dialogue. Because if we fail to do that, we would have failed our generation, and we would have failed the people, we have failed our communities. And that's why we need not to be co-opted, and we need not to be told how the process must unfold, because we know where we come from, because we know the struggles of our parents, our mothers, our brothers, the unemployed, the disabled that lives in the informal settlements. We must have those voices there. They depend on us. We need not to be like those who sold out. We need to actually carry the voices of those who are not there, who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thapelo, for that impassioned intervention. And one of the things for me that I'm taking away from your intervention is that in the context of a government of elites who are so out of touch with the day-to-day experiences of ordinary people within South Africa, one of the ways in which we guard against co-optation and the dilution of our radical politics is by claiming the space and the time in an unapologetic way to speak authoritatively on our own stories, on our own experiences, and make no apologies for that. And so thank you so much for reminding us that that simple act of speaking truth to power is so disruptive to the system and is within itself a form of building people power. And so thank you for that. I want to perhaps shift the conversation a little bit to look ahead. We know, for example, that the process that has taken place over the last 6 months or so really is a precursor to more substantive work, right? The actual dialogues, the actual conversations, the actual engagements are yet to happen. And I perhaps want us to maybe then spend the remaining of our time thinking about how that could potentially look like for community-based organizations, social movements, and grassroots activists. And perhaps I want to stay with you, Thapelo. And I think, you know, based on the conversation today, it's very clear to me that there may be people in the room who, like Abahlali baseMjondolo, like eco-education, are like, listen, this process isn't perfect, but we're going to go there anyway, and we're going to mobilize, we're going to build people power, because we understand the urgency, we understand the need of this current moment, right? But there's also those who may say, actually, we've been here before, count me out. You know, we do not have the capacity to sort of engage in another quote unquote talk shop process. And so then my question to you are, for those within this meeting today who are saying to themselves, the national dialogue isn't a place for me, or isn't a place for my organization, or isn't a place for my social movement, what are some of the alternatives for advancing a grassroots vision for justice and democracy? Where are these other spaces that people can pivot and go to maybe have these conversations outside or on the sidelines of the rubric of the national dialogue?
Yes, no, thank you very much for the question. Well, it is very true that South Africans have lost hope in the current government. It is very true that promises were made, promises were broken. 30 years later, people are without services in the informal settlement. People walk distances to get access to water. I left today in the informal settlement where I live with no water as we speak. So it's a reality. So it's very difficult to actually trust a government that has actually betrayed the people of South Africa and has not provided any solutions whatsoever to the people of South Africa. Which is why I am saying, within Abahlali baseMjondolo, of course, we have many spaces. We have the Chairpersons Forum, we have the General Assemblies, we have the community meetings that are taking place. And we are saying, therefore, people must, apply this slogan of "Akukho okwethu ngaphandle kwethu." Nothing about us without us. We must make sure that we that talking about us without us must end. It is the time now to ensure that. And I think for us, I know that there is a word-based process that is going to take place. But we are saying that Abahlali baseMjondolo have already had its own spaces where these discussions must take place. Other communities have already been meeting. But by the way, I want to say that we have been in a dialogue We have been talking about these things for years. So it is not something new that is government is coming to the fold. And we have been asking government to come to the party in these dialogues for years. So that's why we are saying now that when they present themselves to say, we want to listen, because we've been asking for an ear for years. And now we are now going to give a direction, and we are given that opportunity to do that. And I think it is the onus is on us as leadership of movements, because once you get into a space where you get to a hotel, five-star hotel, you get to fly and so forth, those things tend to change people. Because people assume that they now better than the people on the ground, the people who have made them to be leaders, and they forget where they come from. And I think we need not to do that. We need not to forget where we come from. We need not to, so people trust us to represent their needs and their, so if we betray them, this is a moment, if we betray them as the people who are part of the dialogue, then people will have no reason to trust anyone, including ourselves in the civil society. And I think we need to have that introspection and look into deep down in ourselves as to say, when we go to the convention or the dialogue that are still going to come, are we really talking about the issues of the people, so that we restore the hope that was lost as a result of the corruption that is taking place. So the onus is on us who are in the dialogue to ensure that the dialogues are not informed by political elites who have actually lost our trust, who have betrayed us. But we must be deep rooted in the informal settlement. When I was in hiding, when I was provided a safe house, by organization that supported me when my assassination was about to take place, I find myself in this room, and it actually frustrated me because I no longer resonate to what is happening on the ground. And I will now and then go, even if I go with security, to go and see what is happening on the ground, so that you become and you understand the situation of people who sleep without services, women who are facing sexual harassment, seeking a basic necessity such as a toilet, children who fall in pit holes in schools. You need to be grounded all the time and remind yourselves as leaders, even when we sit in these podiums at the UNISA, but we must remember where we come from, because the interest of the poor and marginalized must be a priority for this dialogue. And if it's not, we would have failed the people on the ground. We have failed the people in the Eastern Cape rural areas, in the Zululand and everywhere else, if we are not rooted to actually raise those issues in those tables that we are going to be sitting at.
Thank you so much, Thapelo. Indeed, nothing about us without us, right? And I think that is an affirmative statement that is also a challenge for all of us to say, how are we being called to collectively act during this moment? And how are we going to show up as a community, as an ecosystem, as a sector? Noncedo, I want to also bring you back into the fold. You know, kuthiwa indlela ibuzwa kuba phambili. And one of the things that, you know, when I think about equal education, that that for me sort of is at the foreground, is that equal education is has mastered the sort of engaging with the political system in ways that are creative, in ways which are imaginative, in ways that build rather than deplete people power. And given the rich experience that exists within social movements such as equal education, but also abahlali basemjondolo, Noncedo, my question to you is, how do we, as grassroots organizations, as community-based organizations, how do we imagine a different model of political participation in the framework of the national dialogue, but also beyond? What are the lessons that are within our ecosystem, within our context, that we can learn about engaging with the democratic process in a way which sustains grassroots energy rather than depletes it?
Yeah. Thanks, Sandy. So one of the things I'm imagining, remember I was saying, as we make this call to power, we need to be making the same call to ourselves. Nati, what are we going to do different that doesn't always operate from that place of trauma? We've been talking to you, you're not moving, but there's a moment regardless. So what do we do differently? So we were talking about this idea of we need to spend more time with each other, because clearly we've also lost ourselves in the silos. No? That was a lesson from that convening. Now we need this operation also resourced. Absolutely, Sandy's agreed. Now, where, because Sandy is asking, where are the alternative places? Now, how do you build power while still influencing in real time material changes for people now? So you use the system because the democratic system is there. And it could work well if there was political will. Remember, we said that story. But we must also be working to build things that make us happy here and dignified, that go beyond the state. Yeah? So to do those kinds of things, I'm wondering if we shouldn't be using the next couple of months, the next 14 months at least, to go and revive the social spaces in our communities. Or to tap it, we've been meeting very much so. Tina, we've been breaking churches in Davidton with having youth meetings because we use them differently on Wednesdays and on Saturdays. But the chairs are breaking. Now we are in a situation with the ministers. But it's good that the church is multi-purposeful if there are no community halls. No? So looking at ways to revive our social spaces inside of our communities, to keep meeting now, not as communities, the way we act like we're convening people, né? But just with each other. As CBOs, as what the people that call themselves civil society, when are we meeting to go start the difficult conversations with each other? So that we can hear the call from Mutapela to Wopa. Even us, we are privileged inside of this situation because we call ourselves, we are the sector. And we're also leaving communities behind potentially. And maybe what reviving those social spaces, the young people call them third spaces, another place of safety that is not constructed by anything like government in Njalo Njalo. So even if you are using a community hall, you're using it your way. If we use those and revive those spaces, we compel our own councillors ahead of local government elections. We're having a different conversation. We're not contributing to a social compact, what. Now we are inside the community discussing our issues and the solutions already. Many CBOs are doing amazing things in the Val, for example, to think about alternatives to clean water and cooking without electricity. You know, are we sharing those lessons? Are we figuring out where the young people are? If we take them off the street and Abantu are doing these cool things with the material that's at the dump site, for example, maybe we do less drugs and we can chill on the savannah. Siyithanda ukufa, but siyamosha savannah. But maybe by reviving those spaces, we're doing the work of giving each other dignity and we're learning from each other, but we're compelling those in power to start using the IDP process to make sure those spaces come alive. If the IDP process and the meeting regularly means that now all of a sudden we've got a soccer club coming out for women, then we know what we want in the IDP. We're doing multiple things. We're engaging the system because it's going to happen regardless, but on our terms and not in party lines. So that's one suggestion around where are the alternative places that we could do now to make ourselves ready for LGE. On local government election, we were talking about how we learned at the convention that we struggle with each other, talking to each other. Ne? And I was saying the call for us, is to start thinking about intersecting our demands. When I talk to Tapelo, at the end of us going, ish, then he says, yeah, but when are you coming? Because actually we've got learners there that are having this kind of issue around admissions. See, intersecting issues at dignity, the housing struggle and the education struggle for our Black communities. Now, if we can, over the next 18 months, intersect our demands, then we're not only contributing to a social compact, but we are blowing that concept out the water. We're rebuilding our vision of democracy. And the reason things like social compacts and playing the game now make me nervous is because we're living in a time of austerity, Makabani. I recently heard someone ngesixhosa athi urhulumente wobugqolo, meaning a stingy government. It's making a political choice, take the money and do something else with it that is not resourcing ordinary communities. At the moment, children all over Gauteng are not eating in school. Remember I told you how many children go at least 1 day a week without food. So the school nutrition program is a critical resource for those children and those families. But at the moment, it's not happening. Why? Because the Gauteng department says, look, and the national department decided to cut the funds. That's austerity in real time. Now, we can't build social compacts in an austere budgeting state. It's impossible. And as the most unequal country in the world, we're not only catching up, we need something radical to change, as I was saying before. So what we're going to be doing, comrades, if we all agree, is to not build social compacts, but to run intersecting demand so that Lando Anze was talking to us about the opportunity for interministerial collaboration at government becomes what's the thing that you don't have a choice? It becomes an absolute necessity. It must happen or we die, government included. So I've spoken about two things. The third space is how we use them to inform the IDPs and the process. We're also talking about then how those intersecting demands start to build a new government on our terms, potentially now in real time. And please join us, man, on that anti-austerity campaign. Urhulumente must fall. The last story, and then I'm done. If we continue to make the choice around staying away from participating in politics with a capital P now, government, for me, is politics. Yeah, we must first remember that the opposition political parties that had decided to not join the national dialogue were making public comments that we're not joining this thing because through the vote, our people have already told us what they want. It's such a silly exercise with many money. Bullshit. There are no legitimate branches of political parties anywhere in this country. So opposition political party, and that's why we keep talking about the political elite. Bonke, ziyafana zonke. All of them have no idea, but they make assumptions on the behalf of people by false claims that there are vibrant branches where the politics and well-being and dignity of Uhlala is discussed. That is not true. If we didn't exist here on this call, in our communities, in the country, in the region, people would be far worse off. And the reason I'm making this point is because then I think about, if we don't participate on our terms now, can you imagine the kind of violence we can expect? There's a very good Utapelo now just said, when I was in the safe house, one of many times, by the way, he's not mentioning. It's violent in our state, but can you imagine the class wars of building a political agenda that does not include us as people that are interested in people? That means that we must expect more racism outwardly. We must expect more xenophobia outwardly, more homophobia. We must expect senseless burning, where people now are not just burning the street that occupies their track because we are obstructing economic, but we are burning the church, we are burning the school, senseless burning, because the people that are doing the acting are angry and are not organized or thinking consciously about what we are trying to build in our Blackness. I'm sure comrades in the region here can talk to you about what this means. No? And the other thing is that what happens in our communities when there's that kind of senseless violence is that people like Kat Matlala are heroes in the east of Pretoria, because they are able to accumulate funds using whatever means, and Abantu then have become, in our Blackness, collateral damage to that thing because I want. Now I'm calling that, I'm not going to be Marxist, comrade, so I will go back to the Godfather. I'm calling that class wars, because that's not going to be happening in the leafy suburbs of the parks in Johannesburg. It's going to happen where we live. because we are angriest, we are most affected, we are most undignified, and we're going to start seeing each other as a result of that need. And so I'm saying we must participate, not to endorse, because we're building our third spaces, and the system is important, but we must shape it. And I'm hoping, as I'm saying all these things, it doesn't feel too abstract. These are examples of what I've seen and imagined can work. But my sense, man, the time is now. Let's not let this local government election period, as it intersects with this dialogue story, happen to us. Must be busy, comrades, and together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Nongweto. I think your provocations are landing, certainly with me, but I'm sure with everyone in attendance today. I'm hearing your plea for third spaces. We need to be able to be with one another again. And we need to be able to build that muscle of being in community and building community with one another again. I'm also hearing your plea around intersectionality, that there has to be a way in which we can thread our demands together, and and sort of find a way of collaborating in more meaningful ways. And I'm also hearing your plea around that we also need to be very clear that the target of our rage, of this energy of hopelessness, of being lost that we're feeling, is this untenable political, social, economic arrangement in this country. And participation, non-participation, based on that is not an option. We have to participate. Otherwise, we start turning on one another. And so, Anzio, I also want to bring you into the fold with a similar question. And I think Nongeto's question and response with a broader intervention around what could democratic participation look like? What are the dreams, imaginations that can undergird that? And I would like to hear from you, though, in terms of, based on what you've experienced and seen so far in terms of the national dialogue process, what are the strategies that civil society, sort of broadly conceptualized, can adopt collectively to engage the national dialogue process in a way that strengthens rather than weakens grassroots power? And so can you perhaps just close us off with an imagination of what can civil society do in terms of its participation or engagement with this process, while still holding on to the imperative of building power? Yeah.
It's a tough question. I'm also looking at us as a panel and thinking, we are a different generation to those that have brought us to this point. And I think that that's of critical importance right now. I think that the fed upness that you are hearing in this call is a experience both of our forebears, our parents, our grandparents and great-grandparents, but that experience is more pressing now than it has ever been, because the levels of inequality have never been this high before. And so we have an urgent call on us within this generational cluster to do something that is fundamentally different, as Tabelo is referring to. So I think in the first instance, you might recall about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a report commissioned that was looking at what this sector looked like broadly. What was social justice work doing broadly? And I think it was a useful starting point for many of our discussions, because it gave us a lay of the land in the last 30 years. But the main outcome of that document, in my opinion, was a pointing to the fact that civil society was not coherently organized. So you've got civil society that is up against business, up against labor, up against all of these other sectors, but civil society doesn't show up in the same way. The social movements in civil society are there, and I'm going to speak plainly, so please don't take offense. The way we use social movements in civil society is exactly that. We use them. We extract data, and then as NGOs, NPOs, etc., we use that data to go and fundraise, to perpetuate our own work, and to hell with those who we got the data from. And I think that's a very big statement to make. So I think it's important that we start there, because this is happening time and again, and it builds distrust from social movements who are the legitimate kind of contributors of this data, and the ones that have legitimate and lived experiences that fall outside of the comforts of leafy suburbs, as Noncedo describes them. I think ours then is to try and think about how do we organize civil society, and to what extent do we organize civil society. And I think that is becoming increasingly pressurized in the context of the national dialogue, because as Noncedo was pointing out, we are having difficulty just speaking to one another. So we don't even arrive as civil society in a room and say, okay, we know what the problem is, let's talk about solutions. First, we bat one another out of the room. And that is never going to serve us, because if we cannot put our differences and discrepancies aside to speak to one another, how are we then meant to advance? So I think, a catch way to describe this is we need to rebuild and revive spaces. And it's what Noncedo was talking about. It's going into the communities that Tapelo describes already as organized, and ensuring that political education happens in a major way. Because how do you organize people who do not quite understand why things are happening in the way that they're happening? To give you an example of this, the water crisis is mentioned time and again. Many people are struggling with access to basic service delivery in the form of water. But if you look at the water problem across South Africa, it is not one problem. In some instances, the infrastructure to collect water is damaged. In other instances, the distributing channels to get the water are not functioning adequately. In some instances, you've got informal settlements where water was never supposed to reach in the first place because that was never part of the planning. So when you talk about an issue of water, you're not talking about one issue, you're talking about several issues. And so for us to be able to cohere as civil society, first we need to come to the room and say, can we get the messy stuff out of the way? Where are some of our core challenges, and where are the trust deficits even amongst ourselves? And that's where I'm pointing to first. I'm saying we are extractionist as NPOs, NGOs, civil society, CBOs, whatever you want to call us. We're extractionist because we go to those most vulnerable in our movement, draw data from them, and use that money to do something else. It very seldom is the case that we work with a social movement, extract data from that social movement, and return the funds that we are collecting with that data to those social movements. So I think maybe that is a big starting point, because that distrust is the very same thing that Tapelo cautions against when he says, don't go and throw me into a hotel room and tell me to speak on a panel. And then when I come back, I seem to have betrayed my movement. That's not what we are meant to be doing here. So that's the first one. I think the second one is, we need to align demands that are cross-struggle, and Noncedo mentioned this. When we align those demands, you stop seeing these as disparate people. A person is all of those identities simultaneously, all of those struggles simultaneously. And I think, Sandy, you'll recall during even Fees Must Fall, this narrative was already there that says, stop trying to pull us out. We are not Black and then a student and then poor and then disabled and then trans. Those are not the ways that we live our lives. So when we start to consolidate our identities as one identity, we then have a conversation that speaks about dignity and respect in the way that we live. And then I think when we take it a step further than that, we can then start to talk about a social fabric, because I cannot be part of a social fabric when you do not recognize that I'm not socialized in the same way as you. So when you start to talk about problems, You cannot say that there is a criminal element, for argument's sake, in the context of abahlali basemjondolo when you don't realize that there needs to be dignity and respect in the first instance for us to sit at the table as equals. And so that's where this thing of intersectionality becomes really important. It becomes an opportunity for us to collect and collate as civil society. But in order of priority, we have to first recognize the things that we are doing that are harmful to civil society and social movements. That will be our primary starting point. Once we can recognize the harm that we are causing and guard against it, then we can start to organize. And when we organize, the first point of organizing will be political education. Even last night, I was sitting in a meeting with the CSNDC, and you know some of the frustrations that grassroots activists are pointing out. They say, I'm here in rural Northern Cape. I can't tell you what is going on in this conversation of the national dialogue because no one has bothered to give me the information in a way that is useful to me. Busy talking there about roadmap, you want an IMC, an EPT. Who are these eminent persons? And you know, I must also protect myself. I'm sitting in a meeting even now with the eminent persons. But these are the types of questions that are arising because there is distrust even in this process. Then I think the national dialogue produces an opportunity again. The steering committee structure being made up largely of civil society organizations and not just the usual suspect. This steering committee structure came about where the question was, can we put forward also a diversity of names? We don't just need the leaders of these organizations to come all the time. Even someone who is not a leader of an organization and part of a movement should have equal voice, because this is a South African process led by ordinary South Africans who are living that South African experience. And so I think what opportunity the CSNDC, the Civil Society National Dialogue Caucus, is presenting to us is an opportunity for civil society to sit at the same table and say, okay, let's identify our program. And then once that program is identified, we can see who is working and doing what. So I know, for example, there are representatives there of abahlali, maybe ordinary members of abahlali that sit in that forum. And the contribution then becomes, as an ordinary member here in, I don't know, Lusikisiki, for example, I am able to do this within my community. This is how many people I can reach. And these are the pressing issues here. Once we start to map them, we can see who is speaking where and about what. And then bringing that in alignment again to the national dialogue process, you can then use that coordinated civil society structure that explains that abahlali has in all of these informal settlements a structure that can speak to X amount of people. Equal education has in all of these provinces a structure of children that reach X amount of schools. Labor has come to the table and told us through these unions we're able, and in that way we start to collate and combine the information. And then once we have that map, we can then overlay on the map these intersecting and overlapping issues that bring us back to our humanity. Because once you have identified that map of a conversation, and you can identify that abahlali basemjondolo and equal education and Rural Development Trust, those are not disparate issues. There are many Black people who are poor and Black and living undignified lives, not as a result of them being one or the other, but as a result of their Blackness and an historical injustice in this country. And then you can hit the problem, then you can tackle the problem, because then you've made sure that everybody that is sitting at the table is recognized first in their humanity and with dignity. And then you can talk about anything there, because our problem many times in these conversations is exactly what Nonqedo was pointing out. You arrive in the room. When you need to get to that room, you need to get on a plane and stay in a hotel. But your day-to-day reality is to stay in a shack somewhere that doesn't have basic services. Then you arrive at that hotel, you find that there are police people sitting there, people are coming with bodyguards into the room. How do you speak to someone with a bodyguard as an equal, you know? And then when you want to bring the thing, you're being told, no, you've got 1 minute. And I accept full responsibility of that when I chaired the last segment of the convention, where I'm saying you have 1 minute to speak, but how can I possibly package years of injustice, years of poor experiences, years of being denied basic dignity in the system. How do I wrap that up in 1 minute? And so that's why I'm saying it's a multi-layered approach. You cannot just do one thing. You have to do multiple things, and they need to be coordinated. But we have to start by telling ourselves the truth as civil society, that even as civil society, ourselves as people that work in the civil society space, we are sometimes complicit in the very problems that we are trying to address. And so when we recognize that and civil society can come together meaningfully, we can engage in a national dialogue process with strength in
Thank you, Anzio. I think you might have frozen at the end there, but your message, I think, has been crystal clear for all in attendance here today. And similarly with Unonleto and Utapelo as well. And so thank you all for your sharp insights. And yeah, it's been such a pleasure and such a gift to be in dialogue and in conversation and to learn from all three of you. I am now going to pass the baton to my colleague, Masadi, who will facilitate the question and answer session. I see that there are a lot of questions in the chat, and so let us all perhaps start to engage and make also use to make the most of Thapelo, Nonqeto, and Anzio for the last half an hour or so that we have them on this platform. Over to you, Masadi.
Thank you very much, Sandile, and also thank you to our speakers for such a robust discussion that we have concerning the national dialogue. I've heard nothing about us without us. I've heard that it's important to ensure that there are spaces for community-based organizations to speak to each other. I've also heard that the importance to resource those spaces. And I've also heard that it's important for community-based organizations to utilize their voices and utilize their voices well when they are in these spaces. So a question that we have is, I think I'm seeing 3 questions there from Andrew. Andrew is saying, what are activists in South Africa doing outside the dialogue to push for change? This I'm asking as a general question whose response will tutor or give a piece of insight to activists across the bloc or the region to replicate. And then he's also saying who controls the agenda and the direction of the dialogue, government or the people? And then the last one there is, how are rural and marginalized communities represented in the dialogue? And I would like to call on Anzio for this one, and then also Thapelo, you can take for us the last one. Thank you.
Just for clarity, am I responding to the first or the second question?
The first question, the first and the second question first, please.
So what are activists doing in South Africa outside of the dialogue to push for change? I think that this is actually quite an interesting question. When the National Dialogue Convention was coming about, Hlanganisa had gathered, if my memory serves, I think we were about 20 or 30 civil society organizations, could have been more, I'm not sure of the number, but this was probably the 6th or 7th gathering of this kind. We just kept on hearing of others that had been happening. And so what was evident at that time was that all of these gatherings were having a similar conversation. And I think why that was encouraging for me is, if I recall the way that the Fees Must Fall movement came about in South Africa, it was similar. There were many that were having discussions in various quarters until there was one clarion call that said, okay, we are focusing on this issue now, come together. You've been having these conversations. I think what was important, and it was a task that I had assisted with, was that we took reports from many of these sessions. You have the National Youth Coalition, you have SAWID, South African Women in Development, you have the Social Justice Assembly, you had civil society Unmute, you had, there are many, I can't list all of them now, but each of these had produced some sort of reporting document, some sort of document that was the outcome of their process. And when you ask what they were doing outside of the national dialogue, I think that is the answer. They were preparing themselves in many instances for how civil society should be responsive to some of the major issues in the South African landscape. The intention, I think, is that when you have enough people having a consensus in terms of the broad issues, you can then move them from consensus about the broad issues into action around those broad issues. And I think then the national dialogue presents the opportunity, like Noncedo is saying, to create a third space. So in the first instance, you want people to have discussions in platforms with resources that exist. Then you want to take those discussions and collate them so that you can see what are the similarities in these discussions. And I think when we produced what we called at the time the Working Bible, there were about 12 issues that were consistent across all of the platforms. And then the intention was to try and figure out who was doing what where. So that, for example, in the Western Cape, if the crisis was housing, but in the Eastern Cape, the crisis is food, and in Gauteng, the crisis is criminality, that you look for threads on how do you prioritize these issues and who is doing what where, so that you can also draw the lessons. So Abahlali has a tried and tested modality of engaging with those in their movement. If that way of engagement can be used to mobilize others that are in communities around them, we don't need to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to mobilize, because they've already done that work. In the same way, Equal Education has figured out a way to speak to government and the departments in particular. And so we should be looking at what has Equal Education been doing to advance these pieces of work. I think the second question asks us who controls the agenda and direction of the dialogue, government or the people? And I think that this is a very important and pertinent question. The government, as we have historically understood it, has been an ANC government. And so I think the question is particularly interesting now, because for the first time in our South African history, or at least in our democratic history, we are finding ourselves with a government of national unity, which means that the actors are different to what they have been before. And this creates a unique opportunity then to ensure and insist that the people must lead. Why? Because, as was pointed out earlier on, we only got 40% of those that were eligible to vote to go and vote, which means that you've got a significant proportion of the country who are so disillusioned with what is going on that they don't even want to go to the poll. This means that the people can indeed lead a dialogue. And what we are saying here, even as Tapelo has framed it, is that there is now an opportunity to say, you know, you may have envisioned this process within government. You may be leading it in terms of resourcing this process, but the outcome of this process will not be a government outcome. And we can ensure that by ensuring that in our thousands, in our millions across the country, that we make sure that our voice is not drowned out of this process. The only way to do that is to organize amongst ourselves.
Thank you very much for that, Anzio. Tapelo, on the last question, it says, how are the rural and marginalized communities represented in the dialogue?
Yes, I think this is a very crucial and very important question to ask, because people outside are tired of having been promised and things are not being fulfilled. And people, particularly those who are coming from the informal settlement, the urban poor and the rural poor, have not had a voice heard in government. So we have the unemployed people's movement from Makanda in the local municipality there. They work around issues of unemployment, hunger, and starvation in the area. I think more than that, I think the representation is not the number of people that are there, but it's how people respond to the people. When people are sent as leadership, and we need to be very conscious of this, that we come back and report to the people that have sent us. We have a mandate to come back and tell the people if the dialogue is flawed or the dialogue we still have hope of changing it and so forth. But so that the people become not only passive participants in this whole dialogue, but also put their input as well forward. So I think the onus is on the leadership that is representing people at this dialogue to ensure that the priorities of the people who are living in the rural areas, the urban poor, are actually there on the table as well. So even though we have people who represent in the steering committees as well, that those people, do they really come back to report to the people who have mandated them to be there? The people on the ground actually, are in touch through the people that they send there with what is happening in the dialogue. I must say, for us, we've had many. I mean, there are many platforms that we are using. The General Assembly, their monthly General Assembly that are taking place, where we tell our people, we go to the communities as well and tell people what's happening. Even something slightly as, we had unfortunately lost somebody in the dialogue on the opening day. And of course, the people who were in charge of the program wanted the program to continue even when somebody was actually suffering from a heart attack. May her soul rest in peace. And the people on the ground said, no. If this dialogue is our dialogue, you have to listen to us. Somebody is now sick in this room, and we must make sure. So something as small like that shows that people want to inform what is happening in the dialogue. We've had people who, the dialogue happened, that the second day was Marikana Day. People who were dressed like Mambush, who lost his life fighting for a better wage. And people wanted to inform the dialogue that this is what we need to speak about. This is what is happening to us now. So some of those voices, something as little as those, shows that people are carrying the mandate of the people and they have not forgotten about the people. So I think as much as the number of people are there that are representing rural struggles and urban struggles, but it is how people go back and report to their people, and their people also participate and say, we are sending you now to say this so that it can shape the way the dialogue should be informed. I think for us, we must continue to mobilize, organize outside of the dialogue. We must make sure that our power is not stolen, our power is not, diluted. So the organization on the ground must continue. The mobilization on the ground we must not throw all our weapons and give it to the government because government has come to us. We must continue to keep our weapons because it is the very same weapons that made government to come to us and engage with us. So we must make sure that those weapons remain with us and they are not taken away from us, like how the power was taken away from the UDF, and the UDF no longer exists, and the ANC took over, and the ANC betrayed us. But in fact, the struggles were led by the UDF, and today the UDF is no more. So we must guide against that.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Thapelo. Marianne is asking, and I would also like to encourage our partners and colleagues that have joined. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to state your question. As I read Marianne's question, Marianne is asking, Mr. Jacobs mentioned the Interministerial Committee as a point of entry for rapid results, a very bureaucratic process. What would be the changes so that these institutions work more effectively, and what would be the role of local government?
Thank you. I'm going to try and be quick and pointed on this one because the answer is a very long answer. So I'm hoping that I don't get caught up in the technicalities. We've had rapid response mechanisms and interministerial committees before. The way the roadmap has been crafted in this particular instance is that when the issues are being collated from communities, that there is a way to centralize the key issues and to prioritize them on the basis of what is easiest to resolve first. So the intention is that the Interministerial Committee will receive the issues and use some sort of rubric. The rubric is to be determined, but to use some sort of rubric to prioritize, for example, if there is no electricity in a particular area, or let's say there are no street lights, and this is resulting in gender-based violence or harm, particularly or criminality in the evenings, it should be fairly easy to go and replace street lights to make sure that there is light. That should not take 4 or 5 years. That should take a matter of days. And so the intention behind this rapid response mechanism is exactly that when there is something that is easy to dispense of and deal with, you deal with that first, so that there is a show of good faith and a show of the work of that mechanism. The intention behind getting the ministers together in an interministerial cluster is that the minister has the power to deploy any set of instructions to the local government level and expect there to be action in response. And so when the idea that we had in the CSNDC, the caucus, our idea was, let us then call for a transparency in that process. So if you are sitting in the Eastern Cape and you say the lights are not working, your concern should be visible somewhere on a dashboard, much like how we have the election dashboard, where you see the information as it's coming in from each of the districts. And for that reason, the IEC has been contacted and the expectation is to work with them. Once you have this type of dashboard, when something has been resolved, it will also be indicated there that it has been resolved. And if it is not, there should be some sort of count for how long is it taking for this issue to be resolved and what are the major barriers to the resolve of the issue. And then finally, if you look at a larger issue, so let's say there is something that is very contentious and difficult to navigate. The example that comes to mind is the issue of immigration, because this has been hotly contested even in the context of the CSNDC. What we do in that instance is to try and gather as many conversations as possible to find solutions. And where the solutions are not feasible in the short term, that you then look back at the longer term strategies that are being used and you see how it is that you can deploy those. So for example, in the history of South Africa, a document like the Freedom Charter is meant to be some sort of a North Star. And so perhaps in this instance, you could develop something similar that says, these are priority issues and what we are agreeing to as the country, and this is how we hope to resolve these issues, using the mechanism of the Interministerial Committee. But when the Interministerial Committee is unable to rapidly respond, that issue doesn't disappear somewhere, that it remains within the public realm until such time as it is resolved. So I think that is where it does become different and where I think it might work more effectively. But the key to this, in my opinion, as a civil society, a member of civil society, is that we cannot take our foot off the accelerator. We will have to, once we call for that transparency, make noise until we see the change that needs to come about as a result of that transparency. I just want to say thank you for having me on the panel. Unfortunately, I do have to step off the call because I am engaging the process currently, but I hope that responds, and I'm happy to respond to anything even after this by way of moving through Hlanganisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that, Enzio. There's David's hand. David Mulaba, you can go ahead. You can unmute.
Good afternoon, colleagues.
Good afternoon.
Just Mr. Jacobs is leaving now. The question was basically to him. One is about the national dialogue. Is it a specific agenda that those who are going to conduct those dialogues are going to focus on? And secondly, in terms of the resources, the steering committee, has it maybe agree on how much, or in terms of resources, that are going to be allocated for the CBOs that are going to be conducting those national dialogue? The last question is about the steering committee. Are they the one who's going to train those trainers, or how is it going to unfold? Thank you.
I'm sorry I was going, but maybe if you will allow me, just in terms of the agenda setting, The reason that there is a citizen-led process identified in the roadmap is there was a recognition that the agenda could not be set by people in a room because we won't know all of the challenges. So the agenda is partially set, so there are topics that are recommended for discussion, but there is also the opportunity as those citizen-led dialogues come about for citizens to inform what the subject matter and agenda is in the dialogue. In terms of the steering committee, they are responsible alongside the eminent persons group, the head of state, the interministerial cluster, and others that have participated in the process. They will be responsible for the dissemination, distribution, and kind of reporting on the budget. But that budget in and of itself cannot be clarified at this point in time because the modality that was presented, or the plan that was presented at the convention, changed at the convention. So it needs to be recosted and then produced in the public eye. And you will recall that this amount of 700 million was floated. And there was a lot of backlash against how do you use 700 million when we've got people that are hungry and without homes. You know, these are critical issues that should be foregrounded. But at the same time, there is a serious and important question from civil society that says, we don't have the resources to run these things ourselves, so someone must provide these resources. So I think I must just point out that contention without responding, because I don't know, I can't say emphatically what the response is in terms of that budget. There are many considerations in relation to the budget, and the 700 million is not the official budget, just to make that very clear. I can't recall the last question, but I hope that helps. And again, please excuse me. I'm happy to respond and we can share responses in writing if I miss anything.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much for taking that, Enzio. The next one from Libona is saying, from what I have heard is that the elite are in the forefront and they do not want to see change in the system, but only to reform or to make us assimilate to it. How then is our approach? How should our approach then be?
Yeah, I think first thing is to actually say those things on public platforms.
Okay.
Remember, I was saying to you that government was there to some extent at the kickoff event, the National Convention. But it was business as usual. Not many joined the dialogue labs, so there was small breakaway rooms where people were deep diving different concepts. Weren't really engaged. The people that were in my dialogue room, in fact, were talking the entire time the discussions were on. At some point, we had to stop the meeting and go, no, please, can you just get some decorum? Or if it's too difficult for you, then leave, because you're also being disruptive. These are senior ministers in our government. And so if we didn't have the courage in that moment to say to them, but we listened to you on the podium this morning, can you take time then to listen to people now? But I can't imagine what was happening in other dialogue labs. Some didn't even attend those. And then they ate in a separate place in the corner, somewhere fancy upstairs. So they didn't even eat with the people inside this dialogue. So when I say to you, we had hope around some kind of culture shift of the political will of our government in this process. And that was squashed by being in the room with each other, physically, people on people now. They ate in different places, didn't really attend breakaways. If they did, weren't really focused and or listening attentively or with open hearts. And then they also sat in a different place. There was a little gallery in that hall in the front there that was cordoned off, so separate to ordinary seating arrangements, with a whole thing that was happening in the, if you go to a show, they're in the golden circle is what I kept calling it. All the political elites and their structures were sitting there away from the people and shaking their heads every time someone stood up angry, asking for this right and this dignity. I mean, there was even at some point an elderly person that said in the golden circle now said, yeah, but why are these young people so disrespectful? It's like we fought for this thing and now they don't seem to understand. So calling for patience when people are feeling violated. And so the responsibility, and how do we approach that first, is to name that thing. Political elite, those in power, must know that we see their disdain and their disconnection from our ordinary experiences, and that we need that thing to change culturally now. Because when you're building trust with someone, you need to feel like they are coming to meet you where you are at. Because we are the marginalized in this situation. We are not negotiating, we are demanding. Someone had mentioned the Constitution here, these things are gazetted for us to use. Andrew's asking, what are the people doing? People are resisting. And we're using these tools to go, no, but we know that this right is achievable. The second thing that we need to also be thinking about, how do we see this reform and system change move faster, is the thing we've all been reiterating on this call, is to act together. Find each other as any part of any type of formation in the civil society space, and see where you can interlink your demands. The call for water in our communities, at least in this region, it isn't only about the day-to-day experience of getting something out of your tap. It's about a spatial issue as well. Why is it that Blacks can only live in a certain area? It's about access too, because some people are not receiving water because they're not receiving it because there's historical debt. How? In this kind of climate. So are we joining those that are calling for a different kind of way of distributing social services? If there's no water in our community, so inside where I come from, and please go and follow the young people that are resisting, man, it's called Equal Education on all social media platforms. When equalizers inside the young people, now the learners that are this movement, are calling for reforms and change in their schools, they use the political concept or term of school community. Now that thing is very revolutionary, because they're not saying I need water when I'm at school. They're saying this area that I live and school in needs water. That's an intersectional struggle. Yeah, Ivana? So maybe to propose those two things around how we build the system change, name it, call for what you're looking for, and the attention and the cultural way that government engages people can no longer be patterned. You know that I don't know how many people on this call were there or have watched the recording. The president spoke to open this thing, and he framed his address as questions to the people of South Africa around why the country was so unequal. Questions. He's asking us, why is it that women are being killed and are afraid of men in our country? It's a mess. And so we need to call out those kinds of things, that if people are going to convene us in the name of the presidency, then they must have the respect to prepare to engage people truthfully around what is difficult in government. When I was sharing with the group earlier, it felt like another lekotla, because every year, I work in the education space. Every year we have a National Department of Education lekotla. All the provinces are there, all the premiers are there. But what happens is that they talk to us about, no, don't worry about the system, because this is what's working. Meanwhile, 2.4 billion rand of the money that's allocated to education, the Auditor General says, it is fruitlessly and wastefully spent. No one knows where 2.4 billion rand goes every year, and it's growing. So the paternalistic nature of government, comrades, I think we can't just listen and go, oh no, but it doesn't sound too bad, because it's going to make us feel like when we say there's a crisis, we are crazy. And we are living inside of these environments. Call it out. And the second is insist on the intersection of our demands. And truthfully, the reason I keep saying this is because one of the troubles as civil society we have with government is that you go to the Department of Education, you say, but we demand water in these schools now. And government says, yeah, no, but that's the Department of Water and Sanitation now. Then someone else goes, yeah, no, but I mean, the trucks can't come in here to clean the toilets, the ventilated toilets, because there's no roads. So talk to the road agency or the Department of Transport, pillar to post between government departments. And we must end that by building intersectional demands. Because the only way they can respond to us together with a collation of issues that affect our single bodies is if they work together. And the money of government can do that. The mandate and the policies of government can do that. Let me leave it. I like to do three things. If I think of another one, I will come back.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Noncedo. We are 5 minutes before the session ends. I'd like to also just ask, I'm not seeing any other hands raised, nor am I seeing any other questions. And I'd like to hear some closing remarks from our speakers. Thapelo, we'll start with you, and then Noncedo will go to you. Maybe 2 minutes, just closing remarks of the session overall. Thapelo?
Sorry, I lost you there a bit. I'm sorry.
We're just saying we are closing. We're preparing to close. So maybe just in 2 minutes, closing remarks.
Yes. I just want to say to the activists that are here that for the love of our country, for the love of the people of South Africa, we must never lose hope. Hope is what's going to take us out of this situation that we are. I'm saying this as a shed dweller. I'm saying this as somebody who has lost everything that I had in 2021. The memory of my father, memory of my mother, I would not be able to share with my children because all the photos were burnt in the shack fire that I was on the 11th of July 2021. I'm not speaking from somebody who's privileged, but I'm speaking from somebody who's struggling, somebody who has inherited poverty myself, and I'm in this struggle because it's personal. It's a struggle that I feel, the struggle that I go through every day. I sometimes say and blame my parents, even though I know it was a situation that they were facing. And I say, why did they leave me under these conditions? But I don't want my children to say the same thing about me. If I die tomorrow, at least my children would have something to say. And that is, at least our father saw this and tried to fight it. So I'm saying to activists, let's fight against what makes us poor. Let's try by all means to actually fight and get out of the situation that we are. And I think our ancestors will fight with us so that one day we live long, but not long in the informal settlement, that our lives are going to be better. And the poor women that are facing gender-based violence, that one day we will fight against it and win this war that we are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thapelo. Noncedo?
What's up? It's not lost on me that we are here with comrades from, it's a regional meeting, this one. And I know there were questions here around like the role of the elite, what's happening in communities, what are people doing? And I want to say to comrades that our circumstances are the same, comrades. Our circumstances are exactly the same. Our governments are doing too little in the name of being previously liberation movements. And those that are coming in to say we're offering an alternative are making our communities and us even more dizzy. And the offering for alternatives has become more and more violent and right-wing. We are absolutely living the same realities. The lie that South Africa is a middle-income country, the potential hub of this region of economics, is only for the very elite. The only thing that could make us special is the fact that, with all of that said, we are still the most unequal country in the world. The poor here are very poor, and it's getting worse. And so when we're thinking about how to act on the things that we've suggested on this platform today, let's also think about it as a regional movement, please. We must act together. We've been trying to find, and we've been meeting and talking to our comrades in Mozambique last year, for example. Young people took to the streets to demand and say no. And we're saying, how can we lend our solidarities? Because our time is coming too. We want to catch the wave. The Angolan youth are burning and being repressed on the streets of their own homelands, and that experience is not unique to here. The Namibians have recently said that all people, regardless of gender and sexuality, are equal in this land, but the regression and the pushback on those rights is deep. people are dying and disappearing, and we want to offer those solidarities. Solidarities, we want them because we must help our people, our own families, understand that xenophobia is a distraction and in fact is a violence in what we want to achieve. So hopefully we find each other as regional partners and friends and comrades, because I think the time is now.
Thank you very much, Nongnedo. Thank you also to Thapelo. A huge round of applause to our speakers, and also Sandile, who started us off on the session. Thank you very much for the insights and also some of the strategies that we can use as grassroots organizations in the communities, utilizing your voice. How do you use your voice when you are also participating in these platforms? We've heard all of those, so it's now up to us to also do our parts in our communities. I am seeing in the chat box also some big thank yous and gratitude from our delegates who have joined the session. Thank you very much. Just a reminder that we're on the 29th of October. We'll have our next Grassroots Wednesday session. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.